Deep beneath the castles of medieval France, far from sunlight and sanity, lay dungeons so cruel they didn't just punish the body, they broke the mind. Tonight, we descend into the shadows of history to explore why these underground cells were designed not only to confine, but to unmake a person's very sense of self. Stone walls whispered madness, and the silence became a scream no one could hear. Let's uncover the chilling truth. Slowly, gently, and just before sleep takes you. If these dark corners of forgotten history intrigue you, dust. This is the place to unwind and drift into the eerie, curious calm of the past. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you're always here when night falls and the next quiet story begins. Before we continue, tell me, where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It warms my heart to know how far our stories travel across the world. You might assume that medieval dungeons were always the dank underground vaults of popular imagination, but the truth is far more complex and in many ways more disturbing. The word dungeon itself reveals a fascinating linguistic journey that mirrors the physical descent of human suffering from lofty towers to subterranean chambers of despair. The story begins not in the bowels of a castle, but high above the ground, in the great towers that dominated the medieval French landscape. These towers, called donjons in Old French, were originally the strongest and most prestigious parts of any castle. They housed the lord's private chambers, his treasury, and his most important guests. The donjon was a symbol of power, rising sometimes over 100 feet into the sky, its thick stone walls declaring the owner's wealth and military might to anyone who approached. Most castles, built during the early medieval period, didn't truly have dungeons. The practice of long-term imprisonment was relatively uncommon in the early Middle Ages. Justice was swift and often brutal. Executions, mutilations, and banishments were preferred to the expensive business of keeping prisoners fed and guarded for extended periods. When confinement was necessary, it was typically brief, a matter of days or weeks while awaiting trial or ransom negotiations. But as political structures became more complex in the late 13th century, particularly under rulers like Edward I of England and Philip IV of France, the nature of justice began to change. Political prisoners became more valuable alive than dead. Information could be extracted, alliances could be broken, and the mere fact of holding an important enemy could serve diplomatic purposes. Suddenly there was a need for secure, long-term confinement facilities. Initially, these prisons were in towers. These were considered to be the strongest parts of the castle, and the areas which could be best defended if a prisoner wanted to escape. The thick stone walls of the donjon, originally built to withstand siege engines and battering rams, proved equally effective at containing unwilling occupants. A room that could keep out an army could certainly keep in a single prisoner, no matter how desperate or resourceful. The transformation was gradual but inexorable. As the English began calling these tower prisons dungeons, a corruption of the French donjon, the very word began to carry darker connotations. What had once been a symbol of noble power became synonymous with captivity and suffering. The linguistic shift reflected a physical one as well. Over time, these donjons, prisons, began to be located in the least desirable, but still secure, areas of the castle, where people certainly didn't want their bedrooms or apartments. This migration from tower to basement was driven by practical considerations. As castle design evolved, builders realized that the most secure locations were not necessarily the most prominent ones. A prisoner held high in a tower might signal for help, might be rescued by allies scaling the walls, or might even attempt a desperate leap to freedom. But a prisoner held deep underground surrounded by tons of stone and earth, had no such options. The architectural transition was methodical and calculating. The cold, wet, and dark storerooms or castle basements became these new castle dungeons. These spaces had originally served prosaic purposes, storing grain, wine, or arms. They were designed for preservation, not habitation, the very qualities that made them excellent for storing perishables, consistent cool temperatures, minimal light exposure, and protection from the elements made them hellish for human occupation. The medieval castle's basement was typically carved directly from bedrock or built with massive stone foundations. The walls were often several feet thick, not from any consideration for the comfort of future prisoners, but because they needed to support the tremendous weight of the structure above. These foundations were built to last centuries, and their creators succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Many of these basement chambers survive today, 800 years later, their stone walls as solid as the day they were completed. But what made these spaces so durable also made them profoundly inhospitable to human life. Stone, particularly the limestone commonly used in French construction, has specific thermal properties that medieval builders understood intuitively, even if they couldn't explain the science behind them. Stone absorbs heat very slowly and releases it even more slowly. In the summer, when the air above ground might reach uncomfortable temperatures, the stone walls of a deep basement would remain cool to the touch. In winter, when frost-covered, the countryside, those same walls would radiate cold with relentless efficiency. The humidity was perhaps even more troubling than the temperature. Medieval prison cells, often small, damp and poorly ventilated, were far from the secure and humane facilities we know today. Underground chambers naturally collected moisture, condensation from the temperature differential between the warm air and cold stone, seepage from the earth surrounding the foundations, and humidity from human breath and perspiration with nowhere to escape. As the practice of basement imprisonment became more common, castle builders began to design these spaces with incarceration specifically in mind. Windows, if they existed at all, were reduced to narrow slits that admitted just enough light to remind prisoners that a world existed beyond their cell, but not enough to actually illuminate their surroundings. These windows were set high in the walls, sometimes 8 or 10 feet above the floor, positioned not for the comfort or psychological well-being of the occupants, but to prevent escape attempts while still allowing guards to check on prisoners, without opening heavy doors. The doors themselves became masterpieces of medieval engineering and intimidation. The design of these prisons varied, but they typically consisted of strong stone walls, narrow passageways, and small barred windows. The doors were constructed from thick oak planks bound with iron bands and secured with multiple locks. Some doors were designed with small sliding panels that could be opened to pass food, or to observe the prisoner without the risk of physical confrontation. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of these basement dungeons was their relationship to the life of the castle above. A prisoner, confined in a tower room, might occasionally glimpse the outside world, might catch a fragment of conversation from the courtyard below, might even call out to passers-by. But a prisoner in a basement cell was separated from the living world by tons of stone and earth. The sounds that reached them were muffled and distorted, the distant echo of footsteps in corridors above, the rhythmic thud of doors closing, the faint murmur of conversations that might have been about their fate or might have been about the weather. This acoustic isolation was not accidental. Medieval architects understood that complete sensory deprivation was a form of torture far more subtle and effective than physical pain. A man could steel himself against the rack or the thumbscrew, could find reserves of courage to face even the most brutal interrogation. But the slow erosion of sanity that came from endless days in perfect darkness, perfect silence, perfect solitude, that was a different kind of challenge entirely. The psychology of these spaces was reinforced by their physical dimensions. Cells were small, dark, and infested with vermin, amplifying the psychological torment. Many basement cells were barely large enough for a grown man to lie down fully, extended. Others were tall enough to stand but too narrow to pace more than a few steps in any direction. The restriction of movement was a constant reminder of powerlessness, a physical manifestation of the prisoner's reduced circumstances. As you contemplate these architectural choices, consider how deliberately they were made. Every aspect of dungeon design served a purpose beyond mere security. The thickness of the walls, the height of the windows, the dimensions of the cells, the materials used in construction, all of these reflected a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the various ways that physical environment could be used to break the human spirit. But how did these theoretical principles of psychological architecture translate into the actual experience of imprisonment? What did it feel like to descend those stone steps for the first time, to hear the heavy door swing shut behind you, to realize that the darkness was not temporary, but absolute? The transformation from person to prisoner was not just legal or social. It was fundamentally architectural, a physical relocation that represented a complete severing from the human community above. The medieval understanding of how physical environment affects human psychology was sophisticated, even if it wasn't expressed in modern scientific terms. Castle builders and dungeon keepers developed their knowledge through centuries of observation, trial, and error, creating spaces that were as effective at breaking minds as they were at confining bodies. Consider the matter of light, something we take so completely for granted that we rarely think about its psychological necessity. In a typical basement dungeon, illumination came only from what little daylight could filter through those narrow, high-set windows, and then only during the middle hours of bright days. For most of the time, all night, all winter mornings, and evenings, all cloudy days, the prisoner existed in absolute darkness. Modern research confirms what medieval jailers intuited. Extended periods without light have profound effects on human mental health. The absence of natural light disrupts circadian rhythms, leading to sleep disorders, depression, and disorientation. But in medieval dungeons, this disruption was far more severe than anything experienced in modern settings. There were no electric lights to provide even minimal illumination, no clocks to mark the passage of time, no regular schedule of meals or activities to provide temporal anchors. A prisoner might receive food once a day, or twice, or irregularly. The timing was often deliberately inconsistent to prevent the establishment of any routine. Days and nights blurred in the endless darkness, and the weight of chains reminded captives of their powerlessness. Without visual cues to distinguish morning from evening, without the rhythm of daily activities to mark the passage of time, prisoners quickly lost all sense of chronology. Hours stretched into eternities, days compressed into moments. The psychological literature describes this as temporal disintegration, and it's one of the most reliable ways to induce mental breakdown. The cold was another constant torment, and one that medieval architects seemed to understand with surprising precision. The basement locations of most dungeons meant that they remained at or near the temperature of the surrounding earth, typically between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit in most of northern France. This is not cold enough to cause immediate harm or death, but it is well below human comfort levels, particularly for someone who cannot move around freely or generate heat through physical activity. Shackles and stocks immobilized prisoners, ensuring they could neither move freely nor escape their confines. The restraints served multiple purposes beyond simple security. Heavy iron manacles around the wrists and ankles made any movement awkward and exhausting. The constant pressure and weight of the metal created ongoing discomfort that never allowed for complete rest or relaxation. More importantly, the restraints prevented prisoners from engaging in the kind of vigorous physical activity that might help them stay warm in their cold cells. The psychological effects of chronic cold are well documented. As body temperature drops, cognitive function declines, concentration becomes difficult, memory suffers, decision-making abilities deteriorate. In a medieval dungeon, where a prisoner might need all his mental faculties to plan an escape, to remember important information, for potential negotiations, or simply to maintain his sanity, this cognitive impairment was devastating. Humidity created its own set of problems. The combination of cold stone walls and warm air from human respiration created a constant process of condensation. Water beaded on the walls and dripped steadily onto the floor, creating puddles that never dried and a pervasive dampness that penetrated everything. Clothing, bedding, if any, was provided, and eventually the prisoners' bones themselves. This dampness contributed to a host of health problems. Respiratory conditions flourished in the moist air. Skin conditions developed from constant contact with wet stone and fabric. Joints stiffened and ached. Wounds healed slowly, if at all. But beyond these physical effects, the dampness created a psychological atmosphere of decay and neglect. Everything in the cell felt perpetually unclean, mildewed, rotting. The smell of moisture mixed with human waste, unwashed bodies, and decaying food scraps created an olfactory environment that was almost unbearable. The stones themselves seemed to absorb and hold these odors, radiating them back with the persistence of centuries. Cells were small, dark, and infested with vermin, amplifying the psychological torment. The vermin, rats, mice, insects of various kinds, were attracted by food scraps and human waste, but they stayed for the shelter and safety of the dark, relatively undisturbed underground spaces. Rats, in particular, became a source of ongoing psychological torment. Medieval prisoners wrote about the sound of rats moving through the walls, scratching and gnawing constantly, sometimes growing so bold that they would attempt to steal food from the prisoner's hands, or even nibble on exposed skin while the person slept. The rats seemed to understand that the chained, weakened humans posed no threat, and they lost their usual fear of human presence. But the rats also served an important psychological function for the prison keepers. They were a constant reminder to prisoners of their reduced status in the hierarchy of living things. A free man could chase away a rat, could protect his food and his space from vermin invasion. A chained prisoner could not. The inability to defend oneself against even the smallest and most contemptible creatures was a daily lesson in powerlessness. The acoustic properties of stone dungeons created their own form of torment. Sound behaved strangely in these spaces. The hard stone surfaces reflected noise rather than absorbing it, creating echoes that could distort a prisoner's own voice beyond recognition. A whisper might reverberate for several seconds. A shout might seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. These acoustic peculiarities made it difficult for prisoners to judge distances, to locate the sources of sounds, or even to trust their own voices. Some medieval accounts suggest that dungeon architects deliberately designed these spaces to enhance feelings of isolation and confusion. In the Middle Ages Europe, were dungeons and prisons made so that when the prisoner speaks, it echoes to enhance the feeling of loneliness and abandonment. While we cannot verify the deliberate intent in every case, the acoustic effects were certainly observable and certainly contributed to the psychological pressure on prisoners. The isolation was perhaps the most carefully crafted aspect of dungeon design. Isolation was another tool used to break the spirit of prisoners. Medieval castle builders understood that humans are fundamentally social creatures. Complete isolation from human contact is one of the most severe forms of psychological torture possible, more devastating in many ways than physical pain or deprivation. In a well-designed dungeon, a prisoner might go days or even weeks without seeing another human face. Food could be passed through slots indoors. Waste removal could be handled through drainage systems or infrequent brief visits from guards who were instructed not to engage in conversation. The prisoner was reduced to a state of complete dependence while being simultaneously cut off from all human connection. This combination of environmental factors, cold, darkness, dampness, vermin, acoustic distortion, and isolation, created a perfect storm of psychological pressure that few human minds could withstand indefinitely. The effects were cumulative and mutually reinforcing. The cold made sleep difficult, which impaired cognitive function, which made it harder to cope with the isolation, which increased anxiety and depression, which made the cold seem more unbearable, and so on in an endless cycle of deterioration. Medieval records, where they exist, document the progression of mental breakdown in imprisoned individuals. The initial stages typically involved anger and defiance. Prisoners would shout threats, make demands, attempt to negotiate. As weeks passed, this often gave way to bargaining and pleading. Eventually, many prisoners descended into a kind of resigned apathy, speaking little, eating little, showing little interest in anything beyond their immediate physical needs. But what happened to those who endured these conditions for months or years? How did the human mind adapt to circumstances so far outside the normal range of human experience? And what evidence remains today of the individual human beings who lived and died in these carefully crafted chambers of despair, in the depths of medieval dungeons where darkness reigned and silence was absolute? Prisoners found ways to leave marks of their existence that would outlast their own lives. The graffiti carved into stone walls represents perhaps the most poignant evidence of the human experience within these architectural instruments of psychological torture. These scratched messages, names, dates, and symbols provide an intimate glimpse into minds under extreme duress, revealing how imprisonment affected individual consciousness and identity. The act of carving graffiti in a medieval dungeon was itself a significant undertaking. Prisoners typically had no tools designed for the purpose, no chisels, no awls, no proper cutting implements. Instead, they used whatever they could find or fashion: fragments of metal from their chains, pieces of bone from their meager meals, sharp stones that might have fallen from the cell walls, or even their own fingernails when nothing else was available. The physical challenge of creating permanent marks in stone was enormous. Limestone, the most common building material for French castles, is relatively soft as stone goes, but carving through it with improvised tools required thousands of repetitive scratching motions. A single letter might take hours to complete. A complete word or phrase could represent days or weeks of patient work. The depth and clarity of surviving graffiti therefore indicate not just momentary impulses, but sustained, obsessive effort over extended periods. At Pontefract Castle, where dungeons were later used as ammunition stores during the English Civil War, visitors can still see the graffiti that old prisoners scratched into the walls of their prison. These markings range from simple scratches, possibly tally marks counting days of imprisonment, to elaborate inscriptions recording names, dates, and sometimes brief messages. The psychological motivation behind this graffiti making was complex. On the most basic level, carving marks into stone was a way of asserting continued existence, of proving to oneself and to potential future observers that the prisoner had been there, had lived, had mattered. In an environment designed to erase individual identity and reduce prisoners to anonymous suffering, the act of writing one's name became a form of resistance. But the graffiti also served more immediate psychological functions. The repetitive physical motion of carving provided a focus for attention that could help distract from hunger, cold, and despair. It gave prisoners a sense of purpose and progress in an environment where time seemed frozen and hope was systematically extinguished. Each scratch mark represented a tiny victory over the oppressive system that sought to reduce them to passive victims. Some of the most revealing graffiti consists of calendar markings, scratches organized into groups that clearly represent attempts to track the passage of time. These markings reveal the struggle to maintain temporal orientation in an environment specifically designed to cause temporal disintegration. The pattern of these marks often tells a story. Initially careful and regular, they sometimes become irregular or stop abruptly, suggesting either rescue, death, or psychological breakdown. Religious imagery and text appear frequently in dungeon graffiti, reflecting the central role of faith in medieval culture and the particular importance of religious belief as a psychological coping mechanism under extreme duress. Crosses, religious phrases, and appeals to saints indicate that many prisoners turned to spiritual resources when all earthly help seemed absent. The frequency of religious graffiti also suggests that faith remained strong even under conditions that might test the most devout believer's confidence in divine justice. At the Château de Vincennes, one prisoner left perhaps the most eloquent testimony to the psychological impact of dungeon imprisonment. He inscribed Domus Dolorum, the House of Sorrows, on his cell wall. This Latin phrase captures not just individual suffering, but the recognition that the architecture itself was designed to produce and amplify human misery. The prisoner who carved these words understood that he was not just confined within walls, but trapped within a machine specifically engineered to break the human spirit. The choice to use Latin for this inscription is itself significant. Latin was the language of education of the Church of formal legal proceedings. By inscribing his suffering in Latin, this prisoner was asserting his continued claim to civilization, education, and dignity. He was refusing to be reduced to the animal-like state that his captors presumably intended. Other graffiti reveals the social backgrounds of prisoners, names that include titles or family connections, heraldic symbols, and references to specific places or events help historians understand who was imprisoned in these dungeons and for what reasons. The graffiti serves as an unofficial historical record, often providing information that official documents omit or distort. Some inscriptions appear to be messages intended for specific future readers, family members, fellow prisoners, or sympathetic guards. These messages represent touching attempts to maintain connection with the outside world, to bridge the terrible isolation that was such a central feature of dungeon imprisonment. A prisoner might carve instructions for finding hidden property, expressions of love for family members, or warnings about the political circumstances that led to their imprisonment. The technical quality of the graffiti varies dramatically, reflecting both the tools available and the mental state of the prisoners. Some inscriptions are carefully planned and executed, with straight lines, even spacing, and clear lettering. Others are crude, hasty, almost desperate in their execution. The deterioration in the quality of graffiti from the same hand over time can provide insight into the progression of psychological breakdown under the stress of prolonged imprisonment. Interestingly, some dungeon graffiti includes references to other prisoners, either by name or by description. These inscriptions provide evidence that not all prisoners were held in complete isolation, that some communication or interaction occurred between inmates. They also suggest that prisoners were aware of a broader community of suffering, that they understood their individual experience as part of a larger system of political oppression. The preservation of this graffiti across centuries is itself remarkable. The dry, stable conditions within many stone dungeons have protected these inscriptions from weathering that would have destroyed outdoor carvings long ago. In some cases, the graffiti represents the only direct testimony from people whose names appear nowhere else in the historical record. individuals who were officially forgotten, but who managed to leave permanent evidence of their existence. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed graffiti that was invisible to earlier observers. Careful lighting can bring out scratches that are too shallow to see under normal conditions. Digital enhancement can clarify partially obliterated text. In some cases, researchers have discovered layers of graffiti where later prisoners carved over earlier inscriptions, creating palimpsests of human suffering that span decades or centuries. The cumulative effect of studying this graffiti is profound. Each individual inscription might seem like a small thing, a name, a date, a brief prayer, or curse. But, taken together, they represent a chorus of voices from across the centuries, all bearing witness to the same fundamental truth, that the human spirit, even under the most extreme duress, continues to assert its existence, to claim its dignity, to insist that its suffering matters. Yet the graffiti also raises disturbing questions about the experiences of those who left no marks behind. For every inscription that survives, how many prisoners lacked the tools, the strength, the literacy, or the mental clarity to leave evidence of their existence? How many died before they could complete their messages? How many were held in cells, so well designed for isolation that even this minimal form of self-expression was impossible? As we move deeper into our exploration of medieval French dungeons, we must remember that the graffiti represents only a fraction of the total human suffering these spaces contained. The voices that speak to us across the centuries through scratched stone are likely the voices of the relatively privileged, those with education, tools, and sufficient mental resilience to engage in the long, difficult work of carving permanent messages. The completely broken, the utterly powerless, the truly forgotten, their stories are lost to us forever. But perhaps there was another category of dungeon entirely, one that eliminated even these minimal possibilities for self-expression and a human connection. What if imprisonment could be designed to be so complete, so total, that the very possibility of resistance, even the resistance represented by graffiti, was eliminated entirely? What architectural horror could make even the basement dungeons we have described seem relatively humane by comparison? In the darkest corners of medieval architectural innovation lay a creation so perfectly engineered for human suffering that its very name means to forget. The oubliette, from the French verb oublier, meaning to forget, represented the ultimate evolution of dungeon design, a space where the conventional relationship between jailer and prisoner was replaced by a more fundamental relationship between architecture and abandonment. Unlike the basement dungeons we have explored, which maintained at least the fiction of imprisonment within a larger system of justice, oubliettes were designed with a different purpose entirely. They were not holding cells awaiting trial, bargaining chips for ransom negotiations, or even punishment chambers where sentences were served and completed. They were, quite literally, places where people were put to be forgotten, spaces engineered to make human beings disappear as completely as if they had never existed. The physical design of an oubliette was deceptively simple. The oubliette itself was bottle-like, meaning once a prisoner was thrown in from the top, they had no chance of clambering out. Picture, if you will, a narrow vertical shaft carved deep into solid stone or earth, typically 8 to 12 feet, deep, sometimes deeper. The shaft would begin with a relatively narrow opening at floor level in a castle corridor or dungeon chamber, perhaps 2 or 3 feet in diameter. This opening could be covered with a trap door that, when closed, was flush with the surrounding floor and virtually undetectable. Below this entrance, the shaft would widen slightly, creating the bottle shape that gave these prisons their alternative name of bottle dungeons. This widening served a practical purpose. It ensured that even if a prisoner could somehow reach up toward the opening, The overhanging walls would prevent them from getting a grip that might allow escape. The individual was hurled in from a trap door at the top, with a lengthy, narrow descent to the bottom. The dimensions were calculated with cruel precision. The prison itself allowed little room for maneuver. In fact, many of them were built so the person inside couldn't sit, kneel, or do much else but stand and await their fate. The floor space at the bottom might be as small as 3 feet in diameter, enough for a person to stand upright, but not large enough to lie down comfortably or pace in any meaningful way. The height from floor to ceiling of the bottom chamber was typically just tall enough for an average person to stand upright, ensuring that the prisoner could not even find relief through different postures. This architectural constraint created a form of torture that was both subtle and devastating. The human body is not designed to remain standing for extended periods. Without the ability to sit or lie down properly, prisoners would experience muscle fatigue, joint pain, and eventually more serious circulatory problems. Sleep, if it occurred at all, would be fitful and uncomfortable, leading to the kind of chronic exhaustion that undermines both physical health and mental resilience. The construction of these bottle dungeons required considerable skill and planning. The shaft had to be carved or built with precisely calculated angles to create the bottle shape that prevented escape. The walls had to be smooth enough to offer no handholds, yet stable enough to support the weight of the stone or earth above. The floor had to provide adequate drainage to prevent the chamber from filling with water during heavy rains, yet not so much drainage that the moisture essential for the psychological torture of dampness would be eliminated. French castle builders became particularly sophisticated in their oubliette construction techniques. Archaeological evidence suggests that many French oubliettes were carved directly from bedrock, taking advantage of natural limestone formations that provided both structural stability and the moisture-retaining properties that made these chambers so psychologically devastating. The limestone common in much of northern France was ideal for this purpose, soft enough to carve with medieval tools, yet hard enough to create smooth, unclimbable walls. The construction process itself reveals the deliberate nature of these installations. Unlike dungeon chambers that might be converted from existing basements or storage rooms, oubliettes had to be purpose-built. Someone had to design them, plan their dimensions, and oversee their construction. Someone had to calculate the precise diameter that would allow a human being to be dropped through the opening, but would prevent escape. Someone had to determine the ideal depth that would ensure both psychological impact and practical impossibility of rescue. The trapdoors that sealed these chambers were engineering marvels in their own right. They had to be strong enough to support the weight of people walking over them, yet easily opened when access was required. Many were designed with counterweight systems that allowed a single guard to lift the heavy stone or wooden covers. Some incorporated locking mechanisms that could only be operated from above, ensuring that even if a prisoner somehow reached the door, they could not open it from below. There was no source of light, meaning anyone tossed into an oubliette was confined in complete darkness for the duration of their nightmarish stay. This darkness was absolute in a way that is difficult for modern people to comprehend. Without electric lights, without windows, without even the possibility of torch or candle flame in the confined space, prisoners experienced a level of light deprivation that was total and unrelenting. The psychological effects of this absolute darkness began almost immediately. Human beings have evolved to use visual cues for spatial orientation, for emotional regulation, for the basic understanding of their environment. Remove light completely, and the mind begins to play tricks almost at once. Hallucinations are common in extended darkness, as the brain attempts to provide visual input when none exists. These hallucinations often become more vivid and disturbing over time, adding another layer of psychological torture to the already unbearable physical conditions. But darkness also served a more practical purpose for the prison keepers. A prisoner who could not see, could not examine their prison for possible escape routes, could not assess the structural integrity of the walls, could not even determine with certainty how deep they were or what might exist beyond their immediate cell. The darkness eliminated the possibility of hope based on observation and planning. The temperature in these underground chambers was typically several degrees colder than the basement dungeons we have discussed. The greater depth and smaller volume meant that they remained at the temperature of the surrounding earth year-round, cold enough to be deeply uncomfortable, but not cold enough to provide the mercy of quick death from exposure. Inside a cold, dark oubliette, there was nothing for a person to do but be with their own thoughts. This enforced contemplation in absolute solitude was perhaps the most diabolical aspect of oubliette design. Unlike prisoners in regular dungeons, who might occasionally hear sounds from the castle above or receive visits from guards, oubliette prisoners experienced a level of isolation that was almost cosmic in its completeness. They were accompanied by nothing but the rats who lived among them. The presence of rats in these chambers added another dimension of horror. Rats could enter and exit through small gaps in the construction that were far too small for human escape. They would gnaw on food scraps, but in the desperation of hunger, they might also gnaw on the prisoners themselves. Medieval accounts describe prisoners who were found with their fingers or toes partially consumed by rats, suggesting that the weakened state of the victims made them vulnerable to attacks by increasingly bold vermin. The feeding of oubliette prisoners, when it occurred at all, was a logistical challenge that reveals much about the intended function of these spaces. Food and water could be lowered through the opening on ropes, but this required opening the trap door and risking discovery of the hidden chamber. More commonly, prisoners were simply left to die of starvation and dehydration, the process, typically, taking anything from a few days to upwards of 10 days. The waste disposal problem in oubliettes was typically solved by the simple expedient of not solving it at all. When one prisoner died, the guards wouldn't remove or dispose of the corpse, the rats would eat it, and another prisoner would be thrown in with the decaying corpse. This practice transformed oubliettes into charnel houses where living prisoners were forced to share their space with the remains of previous victims. Archaeological excavations of medieval oubliettes have confirmed these grisly practices. Oubliettes were built in castles across Europe, and upon being discovered centuries later, many were found with the bones of the prisoners still trapped inside. Some excavations have revealed multiple layers of human remains, suggesting that these chambers were used repeatedly over long periods. The social and legal context of oubliette use reveals their function within the broader system of medieval justice and politics. These were not spaces for common criminals who would typically face swift execution or physical punishment. Instead, they were reserved for individuals whose disappearance needed to be both complete and deniable. Political rivals who could not be publicly executed, witnesses to embarrassing events, individuals whose continued existence posed ongoing threats to those in power, these were the people who found themselves dropped into the darkness and forgotten. What made oubliettes particularly effective as tools of political control was their deniability. A public execution created martyrs and could provoke retaliation. A prisoner held in a visible dungeon might be discovered by allies or rescued in a raid, but a person dropped into an oubliette simply vanished. There was no body to discover, no grave to mark, no evidence that they had ever been imprisoned at all. They could be said to have fled the country, died in an accident, or simply disappeared mysteriously. Yet despite their designed function as places of forgetting, some evidence of oubliette prisoners has survived. How did these stories emerge from spaces designed to eliminate all trace of their occupants? What traces remain of people who were meant to leave no traces at all. The survival of oubliette accounts often depended on accidents of history and rare moments of discovery. Sometimes castle sieges would result in the capture of records that detailed the locations of hidden chambers. Occasionally, renovation work or structural repairs would reveal spaces that had been sealed for decades or centuries. In rare cases, prisoners were retrieved alive after shorter periods of confinement, and their testimony provided evidence of practices that were otherwise completely hidden. One of the most significant sources of information about oubliettes comes from historical accounts, though they are few and far between. The secretive nature of these installations meant that they were rarely documented in official records. When they were mentioned at all, it was typically in coded language or euphemistic terms that concealed their true nature. Some evidence comes from architectural analysis of surviving castle structures. Modern archaeologists have identified chambers with the characteristic bottle shape and dimensions that suggest oubliette use, even when no historical records confirm this purpose. The precision of the construction, the careful engineering of the entrance mechanisms, and the complete absence of any apparent function other than human confinement all point to deliberate design for imprisonment and abandonment. The geographics distribution of known oubliettes reveals interesting patterns about their use. They appear most frequently in regions where political instability made traditional legal processes unreliable or dangerous. Border areas where competing claims to authority created legal grey zones were particularly likely to feature these hidden chambers. Similarly, castles that served as political prisons rather than military fortifications show a higher incidence of oubliette construction. French examples of bottle dungeons appear throughout the medieval period, but their construction seems to have peaked during the 14th and 15th centuries, periods of particular political turmoil when the traditional feudal order was breaking down and new forms of centralized authority were emerging. During these transitional periods, the ability to make people disappear without formal legal proceedings was apparently seen as a valuable tool of statecraft. The technical sophistication of French oubliette construction suggests that knowledge of their design was shared among castle builders and military engineers. The consistent features, the bottle shape, the precise dimensions, the drainage considerations, the trapdoor mechanisms indicate a developed tradition of construction that was passed down through professional networks. This was not amateur work or improvised cruelty, but professional engineering applied to the systematic destruction of human beings. As we consider the implications of these architectural horrors, we must remember that each oubliette represents not just a technical achievement, but a philosophical commitment to a particular view of human worth and political power. The decision to build an oubliette was a decision to create a space where people could be made to cease existing without the inconvenience of formal execution or the political complications of visible imprisonment. But who were the individuals who found themselves at the bottom of these terrible shafts? What circumstances led to a fate worse than death, worse even than conventional torture? And how did the experience of absolute abandonment affect the few who somehow survived to tell their stories? The descent into an oubliette began with a journey that the victim could never have anticipated. Unlike prisoners taken to conventional dungeons, who might march through castle courtyards under the eyes of guards and witnesses, oubliette victims typically found themselves led through hidden passages, down narrow stone steps that seemed to exist in the margins of the castle's official architecture. The approach to an oubliette was often deliberately circuitous, designed to disorient the prisoner and prevent them from understanding the geography of their destination. Guards might lead victims through a maze of service corridors, storage chambers, and forgotten passages that existed beneath the main structure of the castle. These routes served multiple purposes. They ensured secrecy, prevented the prisoner from understanding how to escape even if they somehow freed themselves, and created a sense of descent into an underworld from which there could be no return. This final approach typically involved a chamber that appeared, at first glance, to be simply another room in the castle's basement complex. The floor might be covered with rushes or straw, masking the outline of the trapdoor that would seal the victim's fate. Sometimes multiple trapdoors existed in a single chamber, their edges carefully concealed by stonework that matched the surrounding floor. A prisoner brought into such a room might have only moments to realize their true situation before the floor opened beneath them. The actual moment of being dropped into an oubliette was designed to be as psychologically devastating as possible. Victims would be lowered or even thrown into the prison and left in the darkness. The sudden transition from the relative normalcy of a castle chamber to the absolute confinement of the bottle dungeon was intended to create immediate psychological shock. One moment the prisoner would be standing on solid ground, the next they would be falling through darkness into a space so small and confining that their body would strike the walls during descent. The landing was typically brutal. The depth of most oubliettes, 8 to 12 feet or more, meant that the fall alone could cause serious injury. But perhaps more importantly, the impact marked the beginning of a new form of existence, so removed from normal human experience that many victims never psychologically recovered from the transition itself, regardless of how long they ultimately survived. The first hours in an oubliette were characterized by a phenomenon that modern psychology might recognize as acute stress reaction. The combination of physical injury from the fall, complete darkness, spatial disorientation, and the sudden realization of absolute helplessness created a psychological crisis that overwhelmed normal coping mechanisms. Historical accounts describe prisoners who spent their first hours in oubliettes screaming continuously, pounding against the walls until their hands bled, or falling into a catatonic state from which they never recovered. Prisoners were lowered into it and left either to starve to death or were fed and left to descend into madness. The choice between starvation and madness was not one that prisoners themselves could make. It depended entirely on the intentions and resources of their captors. Some oubliette victims were clearly intended to die quickly from exposure and hunger. Others were apparently meant to suffer for extended periods, receiving just enough sustenance to prevent death while ensuring ongoing psychological torture. The feeding of long-term oubliette prisoners presented logistical challenges that reveal much about the mindset of their captors. Food and water had to be lowered through the opening, but this required opening the trap door and exposing the hidden chamber. The timing of feeding was therefore irregular and unpredictable, both for security reasons and because the unpredictability itself served as an additional form of psychological pressure. When food did arrive, it was typically of the lowest quality. Scraps that would not be missed from the castle's kitchen, stale bread, water that might be clean or might be contaminated with waste. The poor quality of the food served multiple purposes. It conserved resources, it reinforced the prisoner's reduced status, and it contributed to the physical deterioration that was part of the overall strategy of destruction. The water supply in oubliettes was particularly problematic. Unlike basement dungeons, which might have drainage systems or natural seepage that provided some access to groundwater, oubliettes were typically sealed chambers where water could only enter from above. During dry periods, prisoners might die of thirst before they could starve to death. During wet periods, the chambers might partially flood, creating new forms of misery as prisoners stood ankle-deep in cold, stagnant water. The management of human waste in these confined spaces created conditions that were almost unimaginably foul. With no drainage and no cleaning, oubliettes quickly became septic chambers where prisoners lived among their own excrement. The stench alone was enough to cause psychological breakdown, but the health consequences were even more severe. Infections, parasites, and diseases flourished in these conditions, often killing prisoners before starvation could run its course. Anyone condemned to these dungeons often faced a truly horrific death. Plunged in darkness, surrounded by the bones of previous victims, victims of oubliettes had little to do but listen as the rats crept closer and closer. The presence of human remains from previous prisoners created perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of oubliette confinement. Unlike basement dungeons where bodies might be removed for burial, oubliettes typically contained the skeletal remains of everyone who had ever been imprisoned there. A new prisoner dropping into an oubliette might land directly on the bones of previous victims. In the absolute darkness, these remains could only be identified by touch, the unmistakable texture of human bones, the hollow sockets of skulls, the scattered fragments of rib cages and vertebrae. For many prisoners, this immediate confrontation with their own probable fate was more devastating than any physical torture could have been. The psychological impact of living among human remains cannot be overstated. Every movement in the confined space would disturb bones, creating sounds that served as constant reminders of mortality. The bones also provided practical problems. They took up space in the already cramped chamber, they created uneven footing that made standing difficult, and they harbored bacteria and parasites that increased the risk of disease. But perhaps most disturbing was the gradual realization that came to many oubliette prisoners. These bones represented people who had once been in exactly their situation, people who had perhaps harbored the same hopes for rescue or escape, people who had struggled against the same despair and ultimately lost. The bones were not just reminders of death, but reminders of the futility of hope itself. The rat population in oubliettes was typically large and aggressive. Rats were attracted by the food scraps, human waste, and decomposing remains, but they stayed because the dark, undisturbed environment was ideal for breeding. Over time, the rat colonies in active oubliettes could grow to enormous size, with generations of rats that had never seen sunlight and had no fear of human presence. These rats posed multiple threats to prisoners. They would steal food, sometimes, taking scraps directly from the hands of weakened victims who lacked the strength to defend themselves. They would gnaw on sleeping prisoners, particularly those too weak to move frequently. Most disturbingly, they would begin consuming prisoners who were still alive but too weak to resist, a process that might begin with extremities like fingers and toes and gradually work inward as the victim's condition deteriorated. The soundscape of an oubliette was dominated by the constant scurrying, squeaking, and fighting of rats. These sounds were often the only indication that time was passing in the absolute darkness. The rat noises provided a grim soundtrack to the prisoner's existence, a constant reminder that while human life was failing, animal life was flourishing in the same space. Sleep in an oubliette was nearly impossible under the best circumstances, and completely impossible when rats were active. The combination of cold, dampness, uncomfortable positioning, and the constant threat of rat attacks meant that prisoners typically experienced chronic sleep deprivation. This lack of sleep accelerated the psychological breakdown that was already being caused by the other conditions of confinement. The hallucinations that typically began within the first few days of oubliette confinement were made worse by sleep deprivation. Prisoners would begin to see lights in the absolute darkness, hear voices calling from above, feel sensations of movement or flying that provided temporary relief from their physical circumstances. These hallucinations often became more real to prisoners than their actual situation, creating a form of psychological escape that was both merciful and dangerous. Some historical accounts describe prisoners who were found alive in oubliettes after extended periods, but who were no longer capable of recognizing their rescuers or understanding their situation. The combination of physical deterioration, psychological trauma, and extended hallucination had created a form of madness that persisted even after rescue. These individuals had survived the oubliette in a technical sense, but they had been so fundamentally changed by the experience that they could not return to normal human society. The few documented cases of successful escape from oubliettes reveal the extraordinary circumstances required for survival. Some believe that the oubliette discovered in Nottingham may have even held a famous prisoner, the legendary outlaw Robin Hood. While the Robin Hood account is probably legendary, it illustrates the kind of exceptional physical strength, mental resilience, and favorable circumstances that would be required for anyone to escape from these chambers. Successful escapes typically required help from outside accomplices who could provide tools, distraction, or information about the location of the hidden chambers. They also required prisoners who retained enough physical strength and mental clarity to take advantage of any opportunities that presented themselves. Most importantly, they required that the attempt be made within the first few days or weeks of confinement, before the cumulative effects of the imprisonment had destroyed the prisoner's capacity for coordinated action. But for every account of successful escape, there were hundreds of prisoners who simply vanished without leaving any trace. The efficiency of oubliettes as instruments of elimination was nearly perfect. They required minimal staffing, no ongoing legal proceedings, and no public acknowledgement of their existence. They transformed the political problem of unwanted individuals into a simple matter of architectural concealment. What evidence remains today of this systematic erasure of human beings? How have archaeologists and historians pieced together the stories of people who were meant to leave no stories behind? And what do the physical remains found in these chambers tell us about the final hours and days of the forgotten souls who died in absolute darkness? The modern rediscovery of medieval oubliettes has proceeded slowly, often by accident, as renovations of ancient castles and archaeological excavations have revealed chambers that had been sealed and forgotten for centuries. Each discovery provides a glimpse into practices that were deliberately hidden from contemporary records, offering physical evidence of systematic human destruction that was never meant to be documented or remembered. Archaeological work on oubliettes presents unique challenges and ethical considerations. Unlike typical historical excavations which might reveal artifacts, pottery, or structural remains, oubliette excavations frequently uncover human remains in contexts that make clear the circumstances of death. The bones found in these chambers tell stories of suffering that historical documents rarely recorded, providing testimony from victims who had been deliberately silenced. Over the years, many corpses and decaying bones have been found in the walls and dungeons of castles all over Europe. The preservation conditions in oubliettes have often been excellent for skeletal remains, due to the dry, stable environment and protection from disturbance. Some excavations have revealed bones that retain enough detail for forensic analysis, allowing modern scientists to determine age, sex, approximate time of death, and evidence of trauma or disease. One of the most significant archaeological discoveries occurred at Leap Castle in Ireland, where excavations revealed an oubliette with impaled skeletons. The presence of wooden spikes in the floor of the chamber, spikes that had been deliberately placed to ensure that anyone dropped into the space would be injured or killed by the fall, provided clear evidence that this was not simply a storage pit or waste disposal area, but a purpose-built instrument of execution. The Leap Castle discovery was particularly valuable because it provided both human remains and architectural context that could be precisely dated and analyzed. When the new family took over, they were shocked to find a heap of skeletons in the dungeon of death. The skeletal evidence from Leap Castle showed signs of multiple periods of use, with older remains at the bottom of the chamber and more recent ones layered above, suggesting that the oubliette had been actively used for decades or possibly centuries. Forensic analysis of the Leap Castle remains revealed details about the victims that historical records had never preserved. The bones showed evidence of both men and women, ranging in age from teenagers to elderly adults. Some skeletons showed signs of violent trauma that had occurred before death, broken bones that had healed improperly, suggesting previous torture or abuse. Others showed evidence of the specific injuries that might be expected from a fall onto wooden spikes. Perhaps most disturbing, some of the remains from Leap Castle showed evidence of rat damage, gnaw marks on bones that indicated the victims had been alive when rats began consuming their extremities. The pattern of damage suggested that some individuals had survived the initial fall and had lived for days or weeks in the chamber before succumbing to their injuries, infections, or starvation. French castle excavations have revealed similar evidence, though often with less dramatic preservation than the Irish examples. The limestone construction common in French castles has created different preservation conditions, sometimes better for organic materials like clothing or leather, sometimes worse for bones that might be dissolved by acidic groundwater. But even when skeletal remains are poorly preserved, other evidence can provide insight into oubliette use. Archaeological excavations at several French sites have revealed chambers with the characteristic bottle shape and dimensions that clearly indicate oubliette construction, even when human remains are absent or poorly preserved. The precision of the stonework, the engineering of the drainage systems, and the construction of the access mechanisms all provide evidence of deliberate design for human confinement. At some sites, excavations have revealed multiple oubliettes within a single castle complex, suggesting systematic use rather than occasional desperate measures. Archaeological evidence shows oubliettes were built in castles across Europe, but the concentration of multiple chambers in individual French castles suggests that some medieval lords made regular use of these facilities as part of their standard approach to political and legal problems. The artifacts found in oubliette excavations provide additional insight into the victims and the circumstances of their imprisonment. Fragments of clothing, jewelry, coins, and personal effects help archaeologists understand who was imprisoned in these chambers. The quality and style of artifacts can indicate social class, profession, and approximate date of imprisonment. Some of the most poignant discoveries have been personal items that suggest the victims' attempts to maintain their humanity under impossible circumstances. Religious medallions, prayer beads, and other devotional objects indicate that many prisoners turn to faith as their only remaining source of comfort. The presence of these items in oubliettes also suggests that prisoners were sometimes allowed to keep personal possessions, perhaps because their captors saw no reason to confiscate items from people who were never expected to emerge. Writing, materials, fragments of parchment, metal styluses, pieces of charcoal have been found in some oubliette excavations, providing evidence that some prisoners attempted to record their experiences even in absolute darkness. These writing implements are often worn down to tiny stubs, suggesting extensive use under difficult conditions. Unfortunately, the organic materials on which these writings were made have rarely survived the centuries in conditions that allow for reading. The dating of oubliette use through archaeological methods has revealed patterns that correlate with periods of political instability and social change. Carbon dating of organic materials, analysis of construction techniques, and comparison with dated architectural features in the same castles have allowed archaeologists to create timelines of oubliette construction and use. These timelines show that oubliette construction peaked during periods when traditional legal and political systems were under stress. Wars, successions disputes, religious conflicts, and social upheavals all seem to have increased the construction and use of these hidden chambers. During stable periods when conventional legal processes were functioning effectively, oubliette construction declined markedly. The geographic distribution of confirmed oubliette sites also reveals interesting patterns. They appear most frequently in border regions where competing political authorities created legal grey zones. They are more common in castles that served political rather than military functions, and in regions where centralized royal authority was weak or contested. Modern excavation techniques have revealed details about oubliette construction that would have been invisible to earlier investigators. Ground-penetrating radar can detect hidden chambers without excavation. Digital photography and 3D modeling can document the precise dimensions and construction details of discovered oubliettes. Chemical analysis of soils can reveal evidence of human occupation even when no skeletal remains survive. These modern techniques have also revealed evidence of construction modifications over time. Some oubliettes show signs of being enlarged, modified or improved during their periods of use. Others show evidence of being deliberately filled in and sealed, perhaps when political circumstances changed or when new owners of castles wanted to eliminate evidence of previous activities. The forensic analysis of oubliette remains has provided insight into the health and living conditions of medieval people that goes beyond the specific circumstances of imprisonment. The bones reveal evidence of diseases, nutritional deficiencies, and living conditions that are rarely documented in written sources. They provide a form of historical testimony that speaks directly about the physical reality of medieval life. Some of the most significant discoveries have occurred when renovations of castles that are now tourist attractions have revealed previously unknown oubliettes. These discoveries often force reassessment of the historical interpretation of these sites. Castles that were previously understood primarily as military installations or noble residences must be reinterpreted as sites of systematic imprisonment and execution. The emotional impact of these discoveries on the archaeologists and historians who study them cannot be ignored. Unlike excavations of ancient battlefields or cemeteries, where death occurred as part of understood historical processes, oubliette excavations reveal evidence of deliberate, systematic cruelty that was hidden from contemporary observers and was never meant to be discovered. The ethical questions surrounding oubliette excavations are complex. The human remains represent individuals who were buried without ceremony, forgotten without memorial, and intended to leave no historical trace. Modern excavation gives them a form of historical recognition that their captors tried to prevent, but it also necessarily disturbs their remains and exposes their suffering to modern scrutiny. Some excavated oubliette sites have been preserved as historical monuments, allowing modern visitors to contemplate the realities of medieval justice and political power. These sites serve as powerful reminders of the human capacity for cruelty, but they also raise questions about how historical suffering should be remembered and interpreted. But what happened when oubliettes were discovered not by modern archaeologists, but by contemporary observers? How were these chambers used by specific medieval institutions? And what can we learn from the documented experiences of prisoners who survived long enough to leave testimony? For those answers, we must turn to one of the most thoroughly documented examples of systematic imprisonment and psychological torture in medieval France, the fortress that became known as the House of Sorrows. The Château de Vincennes stands today as one of the most perfectly preserved examples of medieval French military architecture, its massive stone keep rising 170 feet above the plains east of Paris. But for over 4 centuries, from the 15th through the 19th centuries, this architectural masterpiece served a darker purpose. It was one of France's most feared and methodical prisons, a place where the very stones were engineered to break human spirits through calculated architectural oppression. Unlike the hidden oubliettes we have explored, or the improvised basement dungeons that characterized many medieval castles, Vincennes represented the evolution of imprisonment into a systematic science. Here, the lessons learned from centuries of incarceration were applied with deliberate precision to create a prison that could destroy minds while maintaining the facade of royal justice and even royal mercy. The transformation of Vincennes from royal residence to royal prison began in the late 14th century when Charles V of France completed the massive keep that still dominates the site. Originally intended as a fortified palace where the king could retreat during times of danger, the keep was designed with multiple levels of security that could easily be repurposed for confinement. The same architectural features that made it an excellent refuge for royalty made it an inescapable prison for enemies of the crown. The keep itself is a marvel of military engineering, with walls over 10 feet thick at the base and a design that incorporates multiple defensive systems. But it was these very defensive features that made Vincennes so effective as a psychological torture chamber. The massive stone walls that could withstand siege engines also created an acoustic environment where sound was absorbed and distorted, where a prisoner's own voice might echo back unrecognizably, where the silence could become so complete that it seemed alive. The Château de Vincennes has long been a terrifying prison. The systematic use of the keep as a state prison began under Louis XV in the 15th century and continued with increasing sophistication through the reigns of his successors. Unlike many medieval prisons which operated according to local customs and the whims of individual jailers, Vincennes developed standardized procedures for imprisonment that were designed to maximize psychological pressure while minimizing the risk of successful escape or political embarrassment. The architectural modification of the keep for prison use reveals a sophisticated understanding of environmental psychology. The original residential chambers were subdivided into smaller cells, but not randomly. The dimensions were carefully calculated to create specific psychological effects. Some cells were too small to allow pacing, creating restlessness and anxiety. Others were large enough to pace but contained no furniture or features that might provide distraction or comfort. Depending on their location, the jails are more or less welcoming. The deliberate variation in conditions between different cells was part of a systematic approach to imprisonment that used architecture as a tool of classification and punishment. The most terrible of these cells, on the 3rd floor, is exposed to the cold and wind. This exposure was not accidental. The 3rd floor cells had been deliberately designed or modified to maximize the effects of weather on their occupants. The 3rd floor chambers represented perhaps the most sophisticated application of environmental torture in medieval architecture. The walls contained openings that were too small to permit escape, but large enough to allow the full force of winter winds to penetrate the cells. During storms, prisoners would be subjected to driving rain and snow. During the cold months, they would experience the full brutality of the French winter with no protection beyond whatever clothing they wore when imprisoned. One of the inmates left his mark on the walls, inscribing Domus Dolorum, the House of Sorrows. This Latin inscription, still visible today, represents one of the most eloquent testimonies to the psychological impact of Vincennes that has survived from the medieval period. The prisoner who carved these words understood that he was not just confined within a building, but trapped within an architectural system specifically designed to generate and amplify human suffering. The choice of Latin for this inscription is significant. It suggests that the prisoner was educated, possibly noble, and certainly familiar with the language of law, learning, and the church. By inscribing his suffering in the formal language of medieval authority, he was making a statement about the nature of his treatment that transcended his individual case. Domus Dolorum, the House of Sorrows, was not just a description of his personal experience. but an indictment of the entire system of architectural oppression that Vincennes represented. At the opposite extreme from the wind-swept third floor were the ground floor cells, built in the shadow of the wall and at ground level, which were particularly damp and freezing. These chambers had been designed to take advantage of the natural moisture that accumulated at the foundation level of the massive keep. The thick stone walls wept constantly with condensation, creating an environment where everything was perpetually wet and where the cold seemed to penetrate not just clothing, but bones. The ground floor cells posed different but equally severe psychological challenges. Unlike the third-floor chambers where prisoners were assaulted by the active forces of wind and weather, the ground-floor cells created a sense of burial, of being entombed within the very foundations of the castle. The dampness created not just physical discomfort, but a psychological atmosphere of decay, as if the prisoners were already dead and decomposing. Between these extremes lay the fourth-floor quarters, where all the walls are perforated, allowing the enemy to come in from any direction, but also letting in the freezing air. The fourth floor represented perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated of Vincennes' prison chambers, where the defensive architecture of the keep was turned into an instrument of mental torture. The perforated walls of the fourth floor had originally been designed as murder holes and defensive positions from which crossbow bolts could be fired at attackers. But when repurposed as prison chambers, these openings served a different function entirely. They provided just enough light to remind prisoners that a world existed beyond their confinement, but not enough to actually illuminate their surroundings effectively. They allowed sounds from the outside world to penetrate the cells, but in distorted and fragmentary ways that heightened rather than relieved the sense of isolation. Most cruelly, the perforations allowed prisoners to see and hear evidence of normal life continuing beyond their imprisonment, while making it clear that this normal world was forever beyond their reach. A prisoner might catch a glimpse of sky through one of these openings, might hear the distant sound of conversation or laughter from the courtyard below, might even smell the aroma of cooking food from the castle kitchens. These sensory fragments served as constant reminders of everything they had lost. The ventilation provided by the perforations was insufficient for comfort, but adequate to prevent suffocation, creating a deliberate balance between habitability and torment. Detention conditions are therefore extremely difficult. The phrase extremely difficult appears to be a medieval euphemism for conditions that were carefully calculated to remain just this side of fatal. The movement of prisoners between these different levels was itself a form of psychological manipulation. A prisoner might be moved from the relative comfort of a middle-floor cell to the exposure of the third floor as punishment for some infraction, real or imagined. The threat of such transfer served as a constant source of anxiety, making even the most unpleasant conditions seem preferable to something worse. Doors were also built into the ground floor walls, which had remained sealed until then. These passages are used to facilitate circulation within the prison. The construction of these additional passages reveals the evolution of Vincennes from improvised prison to systematic institution. The original design of the keep had not anticipated the need for efficient prisoner movement, but as the prison function became more important, architectural modifications were made to support it. These new passages created a secondary circulation system within the keep, a network of corridors and staircases that existed parallel to the main residential spaces but were dedicated entirely to the movement of prisoners and guards. This separation meant that the prison function of Vincennes could operate invisibly without interfering with any continued residential or ceremonial use of the keep. The acoustic properties of these passages were as carefully considered as their practical function. The stone construction and narrow dimensions created echo chambers where sounds were amplified and distorted. The footsteps of guards moving through these passages could be heard throughout the prison levels, creating a constant audio reminder of surveillance and control. Prisoners could never be certain whether sounds they heard represented immediate threats or distant activities, maintaining a state of hypervigilance that was psychologically exhausting. The lighting of these passages was minimal and irregular, just enough to allow guards to move safely, but not enough to provide comfort or orientation for prisoners being moved between cells. The effect was to make these transfers feel like journeys through a supernatural underworld, reinforcing the sense that imprisonment at Vincennes represented a complete separation from the normal world of human society. The systematic nature of the architectural oppression at Vincennes becomes clear when we consider how these various elements work together. The different levels provided options for escalating or reducing pressure on individual prisoners according to the information they possessed, their political importance, or their demonstrated resistance to interrogation. The circulation system allowed for psychological manipulation through isolation or forced contact with other prisoners. The environmental controls, temperature, light, sound, air quality, could be adjusted within each cell to create precisely the conditions most likely to break a particular individual. This was not the crude brutality of earlier medieval prisons, where suffering was an incidental byproduct of confinement. This was architectural oppression raised to the level of systematic science, where every stone had been placed and every opening calculated to produce specific psychological effects. The question that remains is how this architectural system affected the actual human beings who were subjected to it. Who were the prisoners who experienced these carefully engineered torments, and how did they survive or fail to survive the systematic assault on their sanity that Vincennes represented? The roster of prisoners held at the Château de Vincennes reads like a catalogue of French political history, encompassing royal princes, revolutionary intellectuals, financial ministers, and literary giants. But beyond their individual fame, these prisoners shared a common experience: subjection to a systematic program of architectural and psychological oppression that was designed to break the strongest minds and the most determined spirits. In 1574, for example, Henri de Navarre, the future Henri IV, was placed under house arrest at Vincennes. Although Henri's confinement was officially described as protective custody rather than imprisonment, the psychological effects were similar to those experienced by prisoners held under harsher conditions. Henri was isolated from his political supporters, subjected to constant surveillance, and forced to live under conditions where his every movement was controlled and monitored. Henri's experience at Vincennes reveals the sophisticated nature of political imprisonment in the late medieval period. Rather than simply locking him in a cell and forgetting about him, his captors used his confinement as part of a broader strategy of political manipulation. He was allowed certain comforts and privileges, but these were constantly threatened and could be withdrawn at any moment. The uncertainty about his treatment was as psychologically damaging as harsh conditions would have been. The future king's imprisonment also demonstrates how Vincennes was used as a tool of royal policy rather than simple punishment. Henri was held not because he had committed any specific crime, but because his continued freedom posed a political threat to the Catholic faction that controlled the French court. His imprisonment was designed to neutralize his political influence while keeping him alive as a potential bargaining chip in future negotiations. In the 17th century, these included the Grand Condé in 1650 and Nicolas Fouquet, Louis XIV's superintendent of finance, in 1661. Both of these cases reveal how Vincennes was used to destroy the careers and reputations of individuals who had become inconvenient to royal authority, regardless of their previous service or loyalty to the crown. The Grand Condé, Louis de Bourbon, was one of France's greatest military commanders, a man who had won crucial victories for the crown during the 30 Years' War. His imprisonment at Vincennes was part of the political maneuvering surrounding the Fronde. the civil wars that racked France during Louis XIV's minority. Condé's confinement was intended not just to remove him from the political scene, but to demonstrate that even the highest nobles were subject to royal authority. The psychological impact on Condé was severe and lasting. Military commanders are accustomed to action, decision-making, and control over their environment. The enforced passivity of imprisonment, combined with the architectural oppression of Vincennes, created a form of psychological torture that was perhaps more devastating than physical abuse would have been. Contemporary accounts describe Condé emerging from Vincennes changed, more cautious, less confident, perpetually looking over his shoulder for signs of renewed royal displeasure. Nicolas Fouquet's case reveals another dimension of Vincennes' psychological warfare. As Louis XIV's superintendent of finance, Fouquet had accumulated enormous wealth and had built a palace at Vaux-le-Vicomte that rivaled Versailles in its magnificence. His arrest and imprisonment were part of Louis XIV's campaign to establish absolute royal authority over all sources of independent power in France. Fouquet's imprisonment at Vincennes was carefully orchestrated to maximize his psychological suffering. As a man accustomed to luxury, comfort, and the exercise of enormous financial power, he was subjected to conditions designed to emphasize his complete dependence on royal mercy. The contrast between his former lifestyle and his prison conditions was calculated to break his spirit more effectively than simple, harsh treatment might have done. The financial minister's case also demonstrates how Vincennes was used as part of broader legal and political proceedings. His imprisonment was not simply punishment, it was part of an interrogation strategy designed to extract information about his financial dealings and his political connections. The architectural oppression of the prison served to weaken his resistance to questioning, while maintaining the fiction that he was being treated according to his social status. Diderot was imprisoned in Vincennes in 1749 and Mirabeau in 1777. These cases reveal how Vincennes adapted to serve the changing political needs of the Ancien Régime, transitioning from a prison for military and financial threats to a facility for containing intellectual and ideological dangers. Denis Diderot's imprisonment was the result of his editorship of the Encyclopédie, the great work of Enlightenment learning that the royal authorities saw as a threat to traditional religious and political authority. Diderot was held under a lettre de cachet, one of those royal orders that allowed imprisonment without trial or formal charges. His confinement was intended to intimidate not just him personally, but the entire community of philosophers and writers who were challenging traditional authority through their works. The psychological impact on Diderot was profound and well documented. As a man whose life revolved around ideas, conversation, and intellectual exchange, the isolation of Vincennes created a form of sensory deprivation that was almost unbearable. He later wrote about the experience of being cut off from books, from writing materials, from human conversation, all the things that gave his existence meaning. Diderot's imprisonment also reveals the sophisticated nature of psychological pressure at Vincennes. He was not simply locked away and forgotten. His captors engaged in carefully orchestrated campaigns of hope and despair, suggesting that his release might be imminent if he cooperated, then withdrawing these suggestions when he failed to provide the assurances they wanted. This manipulation of hope was perhaps more cruel than simple harsh treatment would have been. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Comte de Mirabeau, experienced a different but equally devastating form of psychological pressure during his imprisonment at Vincennes. Mirabeau was confined as a result of his scandalous personal life and his conflicts with his father, but his treatment reveals how family politics and state politics intersected in the world of royal imprisonment. Mirabeau's case demonstrates the use of Vincennes as a tool for enforcing social control beyond simple political threats. His imprisonment was intended to break his will and force him to conform to the behavioral expectations of his social class. The psychological pressure was designed not just to punish past behavior, but to reshape his personality and his future conduct. The correspondence that Mirabeau managed to smuggle out of Vincennes provides rare insight into the day-to-day psychological reality of imprisonment there. He wrote about the constant uncertainty, the deliberate humiliations, the calculated alternation between harsh and lenient treatment that was designed to keep him psychologically off balance. His letters reveal a man struggling to maintain his sense of identity and dignity under conditions specifically designed to destroy both. But perhaps no prisoner at Vincennes better exemplifies the long-term psychological effects of architectural oppression than the Marquis de Sade, who spent 7 years there. Sade's extended confinement, particularly his 6 years in a ground floor cell, provides a case study in the cumulative effects of environmental torture on the human psyche. The ground floor cells at Vincennes, as we have seen, were characterized by constant dampness, cold, and a sense of being buried alive within the foundations of the keep. For Sade, a man whose sexuality and literary imagination were already transgressive by the standards of his time, this environment created a psychological hothouse where his fantasies became increasingly extreme and violent. Sade's writings during his imprisonment reveal the progression of psychological breakdown under conditions of architectural oppression. His early letters from Vincennes are relatively conventional complaints about conditions and requests for better treatment. But as the years passed, his correspondence became increasingly bizarre, filled with elaborate fantasies, paranoid accusations, and sexual obsessions that reflected the distorting effects of prolonged isolation and environmental stress. The physical conditions of Sade's cell, the constant dampness that rotted his clothing and belongings, the cold that penetrated his bones, the darkness that made reading and writing nearly impossible, created a sensory environment that reinforced and amplified his psychological disturbances. The prison became not just a place where he was confined, but a place where his mental state was systematically altered by architectural design. Sade's case also reveals the interaction between individual psychology and institutional power. His jailers clearly understood that they were not simply containing a dangerous individual, but actively reshaping his mental state through environmental manipulation. His treatment was adjusted over time based on observations of his psychological condition, suggesting that Vincennes operated according to systematic principles of psychological control rather than simple punishment. The Marquis's famous rage, fits, his obsessive counting and measuring of his cell, his elaborate schemes for communicating with the outside world, all of these behaviors can be understood as responses to the specific environmental pressures created by the architecture of Vincennes. The prison was not just holding him, it was actively participating in the creation of the psychological pathology that would make him famous. Monseigneur de Boulogne, Napoleon's confessor, was incarcerated in the early 19th century. His case reveals how Vincennes continued to serve as an instrument of political control even as France transitioned from monarchy to republic to empire. The psychological techniques developed over centuries of royal imprisonment were readily adaptable to the needs of new forms of political authority. The priest's imprisonment demonstrates how religious authority was subjected to the same architectural oppression that had been used against military, financial, and intellectual threats. His treatment reveals the systematic nature of the psychological pressure at Vincennes, techniques that worked regardless of the prisoner's background, beliefs, or social position. Perhaps the most tragic case was the Duke of Enghien, who was arrested and executed without trial in 1804. While his imprisonment was brief, only a few hours before his execution, his case reveals how Vincennes had evolved to serve the needs of summary justice as well as prolonged detention. The Duke's execution at Vincennes was intended as a message to all potential opponents of Napoleon's regime. The choice of location was deliberate, Vincennes carried with it centuries of associations with royal authority and the power to make people disappear. By executing the Duke there, Napoleon was claiming inheritance of all the psychological and political power that the fortress represented. The psychological impact of these famous cases extended far beyond the individuals directly affected. Each imprisonment at Vincennes sent ripples through French society, reminding everyone of the power of the state to reach into any life at any social level and subject individuals to systematic psychological destruction. The fame of the prisoners served to amplify the intimidating effect of the prison itself. The cases we have examined reveal common patterns in the psychological effects of imprisonment at Vincennes. Initial shock and disbelief gave way to attempts at negotiation and accommodation. As these efforts failed, prisoners typically experienced periods of despair and rage. Those who survived long-term imprisonment often developed elaborate psychological coping mechanisms that bordered on or crossed into madness. The architectural environment of Vincennes played a crucial role in this psychological progression. The systematic use of environmental stressors, cold, dampness, darkness, isolation, uncertainty, created conditions that overwhelmed normal psychological defenses. The result was not simply suffering, but fundamental changes in personality, thought patterns, and behavior that persisted long after release. But among all the famous prisoners of Vincennes, one case stands out as particularly revealing about the long-term effects of architectural oppression on the human mind. The Marquis de Sade's 7-year ordeal provides the most detailed documentation we possess of what it meant to be systematically broken by the stone walls and calculated cruelties of the House of Sorrows. The case of Donatien Alphonse François, Marquis de Sade, represents perhaps the most thoroughly documented example of long-term psychological transformation under the architectural oppression of Vincennes. His 7-year imprisonment from 1777 to 1784 provides a detailed record of how systematic environmental torture could reshape a human personality, transforming a merely dissolute aristocrat into the literary embodiment of sexual violence and psychological extremism. When Sade entered Vincennes in 1777, he was already notorious for his sexual excesses and his conflicts with conventional morality, but he was still recognizably a product of aristocratic culture, educated, articulate, concerned with his social position and family honor. The man who emerged 7 years later was fundamentally different, a literary revolutionary whose imagination had been shaped by years of systematic psychological pressure into something unprecedented and terrifying. The Marquis de Sade spent 7 years at Vincennes, including 6 in a ground-floor cell. This extended confinement in the most psychologically oppressive environment the prison offered provides an unparalleled opportunity to study the cumulative effects of architectural torture on individual consciousness. The ground-floor cells at Vincennes were, as we have seen, designed to create a specific set of environmental stressors. The constant dampness, the bone-penetrating cold, the sense of being entombed within the very foundations of the keep, all of these factors combined to create an environment that was barely habitable, but carefully calculated to avoid being fatal. Sade's survival of 6 years in such conditions speaks to both his physical resilience and the precision with which the environmental torture was calibrated. The psychological impact of these conditions on Sade was immediate and progressively more severe. His early letters from Vincennes reveal a man struggling to maintain the social connections and intellectual interests that had defined his previous life. He requested books, complained about the cold, and attempted to conduct correspondence with friends and family members. But as the months stretched into years, these normal concerns were gradually overwhelmed by more disturbing preoccupations. The dampness of Sade's cell created constant practical problems that became psychological torments. His clothes rotted, and had to be replaced repeatedly. His books and papers became mouldy and illegible. The ink in his writing materials froze in winter and evaporated in summer. Every aspect of intellectual and physical life was subjected to constant decay and destruction, creating an environment where nothing could be preserved or maintained. This material decay had profound psychological effects on a man whose life had previously been characterized by luxury and comfort. Said began to develop an obsessive concern with the deterioration of his possessions, measuring and documenting the progress of rot and decay in his cell. This obsession with decay and destruction would later become central themes in his literary works, suggesting that the environment of Vincennes was actively shaping his imagination. The cold in the ground floor cells was particularly devastating for someone of Sard's age and constitution. He suffered from rheumatism and other ailments that were aggravated by the constant dampness and low temperatures. The physical pain became a constant presence in his life, and his letters reveal an increasing preoccupation with bodily suffering that would later manifest in his literary fascination with torture and physical abuse. The psychological literature on prolonged solitary confinement suggests that isolation typically produces a progression of symptoms: initial anxiety and depression, followed by cognitive disturbances, perceptual distortions, and eventually more severe psychological pathology. Said's letters from Vincennes document this progression with remarkable clarity, providing a real-time record of psychological breakdown under environmental pressure. During his first year of imprisonment, Sade's letters focus primarily on practical concerns: requests for better food, warmer clothing, books to read. He maintains the tone and concerns of an aristocrat temporarily inconvenienced by imprisonment, but as the second year progresses, his correspondence begins to reveal more disturbing preoccupations. He becomes increasingly suspicious of his jailers, convinced that they are deliberately tormenting him beyond what is necessary for security. By the third year, Sade's letters reveal clear signs of paranoid thinking. He develops elaborate theories about conspiracies against him, believes that his food is being poisoned, and suspects that his cell is being searched and his possessions deliberately destroyed. These paranoid ideations were likely exacerbated by the real surveillance and control that characterized life at Vincennes, creating a situation where some of his fears were justified while others were products of psychological disturbance. The fourth and fifth years of Sade's imprisonment marked the period when his psychological breakdown became most severe. His letters from this period are often incoherent, filled with rambling accusations, bizarre sexual fantasies, and threats against his captors. He begins to develop the elaborate sexual mythologies that would later appear in his published works, suggesting that his literary imagination was being shaped by his psychological deterioration. The content of Sade's fantasies during this period reveals the specific ways that the environment of Vincennes was affecting his mental state. His imagined scenarios often involve imprisonment, confinement in small spaces, subjection to environmental extremes, and the systematic destruction of victims' psychological resistance. These themes directly mirror his own experience at Vincennes, suggesting that he was processing his trauma by imaginatively transforming himself from victim to perpetrator. The sixth year of Sade's imprisonment represents a turning point in his psychological condition. Rather than continuing to deteriorate, he seems to have found a way to stabilize his mental state by fully embracing the disturbed thought patterns that had been developing. He begins to write systematically, producing the early drafts of works that would later be published as novels. This literary activity seems to have provided him with a way of channeling his psychological disturbance into creative production. The writing that Sade produced during his final years at Vincennes reveals the complete transformation of his personality and worldview. The conventional aristocratic concerns that had characterized his early letters are completely absent. Instead, his work is dominated by themes of power, control, sexual violence, and the systematic destruction of conventional morality. The environment of Vincennes had not simply confined him, it had created a new form of consciousness. The relationship between Sade's imprisonment and his literary production raises disturbing questions about the nature of creativity and psychological trauma. His most famous work, The 120 Days of Sodom, Justine, Philosophy in the Bedroom, all bear clear traces of his experience at Vincennes. The detailed descriptions of imprisonment, torture, and psychological manipulation in these works read like fictionalized accounts of his own experiences, transformed through imagination into narratives of sadistic pleasure. The architectural details that appear in Sade's fiction often mirror the specific features of Vincennes. His descriptions of prison cells, torture chambers, and isolated chateaux where victims are held captive all echo the environmental conditions he experienced during his 7-year confinement. The precision with which he describes the psychological effects of confinement, isolation, and environmental stress suggests that he was drawing directly from his own experience. But perhaps most disturbing is the way that Sade's fiction transforms the victim's perspective into the perpetrator's perspective. Having been subjected to systematic psychological torture, he created literary works that celebrate and eroticize the infliction of similar torture on others. The transformation suggests that the psychological damage inflicted by Vincennes was not simply personal suffering, but the creation of a new form of consciousness that was capable of finding pleasure in the systematic destruction of other human beings. The question of whether Sade's literary output represents a form of creative triumph over adversity or simply the documentation of psychological destruction remains contested. His works certainly represent unprecedented explorations of human psychology and the nature of power, control, and desire, but they also document the capacity of systematic environmental torture to fundamentally reshape human consciousness in ways that persist long after the original trauma has ended. Sade's physical condition when he was finally released from Vincennes in 1784 provides additional evidence of the cumulative effects of his 7-year ordeal. Contemporary accounts describe him as prematurely aged, physically weakened, and subject to various ailments that would plague him for the rest of his life. The environmental stresses of his imprisonment had taken a permanent toll on his physical health that paralleled the psychological transformation he had undergone. But the psychological changes were even more dramatic than the physical ones. The man who entered Vincennes as a dissolute but relatively conventional aristocrat emerged as something unprecedented in French literature and culture. His subsequent behavior, his involvement in revolutionary politics, his continued literary production, his persistent conflicts with authority, all reflected the fundamental personality changes that had occurred during his imprisonment. The case of the Marquis de Sade provides perhaps the clearest evidence we possess of the capacity of architectural oppression to create lasting psychological transformation. His 7 years at Vincennes had not simply punished him for his crimes or deterred him from future misconduct. They had created a new form of human consciousness that would influence literature, philosophy, and psychology for centuries to come. Yet, Sade's case also raises questions about the intended purposes and unintended consequences of systematic imprisonment. Had his captors intended to create a literary revolutionary whose works would challenge every conventional assumption about human nature and social order? Or had they simply sought to break his spirit through environmental torture, not realizing that they were creating something far more dangerous than the man they had originally confined? As we consider the broader implications of Sade's transformation, at Vincennes we must also remember that his case represents only one example of a system of imprisonment that affected thousands of individuals over several centuries. For every Marquis de Sade whose experience is thoroughly documented, there were hundreds of other prisoners whose stories have been lost to history. How many other minds were fundamentally altered by the architectural oppression of Vincennes? How many other personalities were broken or reshaped by years of systematic environmental torture? The answers to these questions may lie in the broader transformation of French society during the period when Vincennes served as a royal prison. The systematic use of architectural oppression to control political opposition may have contributed to the revolutionary violence that eventually consumed the Ancien Regime. When a society creates institutions dedicated to the systematic destruction of human consciousness, it should not be surprised when that consciousness eventually strikes back with unprecedented fury. The Bastille fortress stood as the most famous prison in France, yet it embodied a fundamental contradiction that reveals the complex nature of imprisonment under the Ancien Regime. While revolutionary propaganda would later depict it as a hellish dungeon where prisoners suffered unimaginable torments, the reality was far more psychologically sophisticated and in some ways more disturbing than simple brutality could ever have been. Despite the Bastille being described as good, conditions in the prison varied widely. This variation was not accidental, but represented a carefully calibrated system of psychological manipulation that used comfort and deprivation as tools of control. The Bastille's true horror lay not in uniform cruelty, but in the deliberate unpredictability of treatment that kept prisoners psychologically off balance and dependent on their captors' whims. The architectural design of the Bastille created multiple zones of confinement that could be used to apply different levels of psychological pressure. The subterranean dungeons or cachots were damp and vermin-infested, representing the traditional medieval approach to imprisonment through environmental torture. These basement chambers served as the foundation, literally and figuratively, upon which the more sophisticated upper levels of the prison were built. The cachots embodied everything we have learned about dungeon design: cold stone walls that wept with condensation, floors that never dried, air that was thick with moisture and the stench of human waste. Cells were small, dark, and infested with vermin, amplifying the psychological torment. Rats thrived in these underground chambers, growing bold from generations of feeding on food scraps and, when prisoners were too weak to resist, on the prisoners themselves. But the cachots served a specific function within the broader psychological system of the Bastille. They were not where most prisoners were held routinely, but rather where they could be sent as punishment or as a demonstration of what awaited them if they failed to cooperate with their captors' demands. The mere knowledge that these chambers existed beneath their feet was enough to make prisoners in the upper levels grateful for whatever comforts they were allowed. At the opposite extreme were the cells immediately below the roof, called the calottes, which were affected by the weather, freezing during the snow, damp and humid during the rain, and suffocating and hot during the sunny summer months. The calottes represented a different approach to environmental torture, one that subjected prisoners to the full extremes of the Parisian climate without the moderating effects of thick stone walls. Winter in the calottes was particularly brutal. The thin roof provided little insulation against freezing temperatures, and prisoners had no source of heat beyond their own body warmth. Contemporary accounts describe prisoners who developed frostbite in their extremities, who found their breath freezing in the air, who huddled under whatever coverings they possessed, while ice formed on the interior walls of their cells. Summer in the calottes was equally devastating, but in different ways. The roof absorbed the full heat of the sun, turning the chambers into ovens where temperatures could reach dangerous levels. Prisoners suffered from heat exhaustion, dehydration, and the psychological stress of being unable to escape the relentless heat. The contrast between winter and summer conditions in the same cells created a psychological atmosphere of hopelessness. No season brought relief, only different forms of torment. Spring and autumn in the calottes brought their own miseries. The cells were damp and humid during the rain, as water leaked through the roof and walls, creating conditions that were almost tropical in their moisture content. The humidity made breathing difficult, caused clothing and bedding to rot, and created an environment where mold and mildew flourished. But it was the middle floors of the Bastille that revealed the true sophistication of psychological imprisonment under the Ancien Régime. Unless the prison was crowded, prisoners were generally held in the middle floors in an octagonal room that was about 16 feet in diameter. These chambers represented a completely different philosophy of imprisonment, one that used comfort rather than deprivation as a tool of psychological control. The middle floor chambers were designed to create a sense of false security and dependence that could be more effective than simple brutality in breaking a prisoner's will to resist. Rooms had varying degrees of accommodations, and this variation was carefully calculated to create hierarchies of privilege that could be manipulated for psychological effect. All rooms except the dungeons also had a stove or fireplace, providing warmth that would seem luxurious to anyone who had experienced the conditions in the cachots or calottes below and above. The presence of heat transformed these middle floor chambers into spaces that could actually be comfortable, creating a psychological atmosphere that was profoundly different from traditional medieval dungeons. The walls and ceilings were plastered and whitewashed, and some floors had tiles or stones. These finishing touches created an environment that was recognizably civilized, that maintained some connection to the world of normal human habitation. Prisoners in these chambers were not being reduced to animal status through environmental deprivation. They were being seduced into dependence through environmental comfort. The windows in the middle floor chambers were iron-grated windows at various heights, providing both light and air while maintaining security. Unlike the narrow slits that characterized traditional dungeons, these windows allowed prisoners to see the outside world, to observe the changing seasons, to maintain some connection with the passage of time and the continuation of normal life beyond their confinement. But this apparent privilege came with its own psychological costs. The ability to see the outside world made prisoners acutely aware of their separation from it. They could watch people moving freely in the streets below, could see the normal activities of urban life continuing without them, could observe the world they had lost in detail that made their confinement more poignant rather than less. The furnishing of these middle floor chambers revealed the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation involved. Marguerite Delaunay, Baroness de Staël, relates that she had hers hung with tapestry. The Marquis de Sade covered the bare walls with long and brilliant hangings. Prisoners were allowed, even encouraged, to personalize their spaces, to create environments that reflected their tastes and social status. This personalization served multiple psychological functions. It created a sense of control and agency that could prevent the complete psychological breakdown that often resulted from total powerlessness. It maintained the prisoner's connection to their social identity and class status, preventing the kind of complete dehumanization that traditional dungeons were designed to achieve. But most importantly, it created attachments and dependencies that could be threatened or withdrawn as tools of control. The case of the Comte de Belle-Isle reveals how elaborate these accommodations could become. His inventory included a personal library of 333 volumes, luxurious furnishings, and personal effects that would have been appropriate for a well-appointed private residence. The Count was not being punished through deprivation. He was being controlled through the creation of a comfortable dependency that made him grateful for his treatment and reluctant to do anything that might jeopardize it. The dining arrangements in the middle floors of the Bastille further illustrate this sophisticated approach to psychological control. Dumouriez had for dinner 5 plats and for supper 3 plats, while Jean-François Marmontel received soup, beef, chicken, vegetables, wine, coffee. These meals were not just adequate, they were elaborate and varied, maintaining standards that would have been considered luxurious by the general population. The psychological impact of this treatment was complex and profound. Prisoners found themselves in the position of being grateful to their captors for comforts that were, in reality, tools of manipulation. The quality of their treatment became a constant reminder of their dependence on royal mercy and their vulnerability to having these privileges withdrawn at any moment. Some prisoners were even allowed to keep animals as companions. Laurent Angliviel de la Beaumelle had permission to keep and breed birds, cats and dogs. These pets provided emotional comfort that helped prevent the complete psychological breakdown that often resulted from total isolation, but they also created additional dependencies and vulnerabilities that could be exploited by captors. The presence of animals in prison cells also created a bizarre domesticity that further normalized the situation of imprisonment. Prisoners could maintain some of the rhythms and relationships of normal life while remaining completely under the control of their captors. This normalization made long-term imprisonment psychologically bearable while simultaneously making it politically acceptable. The variation in treatment between different prisoners was carefully calculated to create hierarchies and competitions that prevented solidarity and cooperation. A prisoner, enjoying elaborate meals and comfortable furnishings, would be reluctant to risk these privileges by attempting to help a fellow prisoner who was suffering in the cachots below. The system created vertical loyalties between prisoners and guards rather than horizontal solidarities between prisoners and prisoners. But the Bastille's sophisticated approach to psychological control created its own vulnerabilities. The Bastille's reputation was worsened by several autobiographies written by prisoners detained there during the 18th century. Former prisoners who had been treated relatively well found themselves in the position of defending their captors against accusations of cruelty, while those who had suffered harsh treatment found their accounts dismissed as exaggerations. The most politically damaging accounts came from prisoners who had experienced both comfort and cruelty, who could testify to the systematic nature of the psychological manipulation they had undergone. Simon Nicolas Henri Languet wrote his book, Memoirs of the Bastille, detailing his sufferings. Languet's account was particularly effective because he could describe not just physical hardships, but the more subtle psychological tortures involved in the deliberate manipulation of hope and despair. When he was deprived of pen and paper, he was galled and felt oppressed. Unable to speak or share his feeling because of the thickness of the 5-foot walls, his mental anguish proved to be so great that he ably recaptured it when he wrote his book. Languet's account reveals how the Bastille's psychological system worked, even on prisoners who were treated relatively well. The deprivation of intellectual stimulation and communication could be as devastating as physical torture. The 5-foot thick walls that Languet mentions were not just security measures, they were acoustic barriers that created a form of sensory deprivation even in the relatively comfortable middle floors. The walls absorbed sound so completely that prisoners could feel completely isolated even when they knew that other human beings were nearby. This acoustic isolation was perhaps more psychologically devastating than the visual isolation created by windowless cells. As revolutionary sentiment grew throughout the 1780s, the Bastille's sophisticated system of psychological control began to work against its creators. Former prisoners who had been seduced into gratitude by comfortable treatment began to understand that they had been manipulated, that their gratitude had been manufactured through systematic psychological techniques. This realization was often more radicalizing than simple brutality would have been. The revolutionary propaganda that eventually surrounded the Bastille simplified its complex reality into a straightforward narrative of oppression and liberation. But the truth was more disturbing than the propaganda suggested. The Bastille represented not the crude cruelty of medieval justice, but the sophisticated psychological manipulation of modern state power. It was a machine for manufacturing consent and dependency, for creating subjects who would be grateful for whatever freedoms their rulers chose to allow them. Yet even this sophisticated system could not ultimately contain the revolutionary forces that were building throughout French society. The question that remained was what would happen when these forces finally exploded, when the carefully constructed psychological systems that had maintained the Ancien Régime for centuries were suddenly swept away. What would the revolutionaries find when they finally broke down the doors of the most famous prison in France? By the summer of 1789, the Bastille housed only 7 prisoners, a number so small that it would have been almost comical if not for the symbolic weight that the fortress had accumulated over centuries of use as an instrument of royal power. These final inhabitants represented the end of an era, the last individuals to experience the sophisticated system of psychological imprisonment that had been refined over generations of architectural and administrative innovation. The small number of prisoners in the Bastille by 1789 was not accidental, but reflected the changing nature of royal authority in the final years of the Ancien Régime. Louis XVI decided to close the prison in 1784, recognizing that the political and financial costs of maintaining such an elaborate facility were no longer justified by its usefulness as a tool of state control. The decision to close the Bastille reveals how the institution had become obsolete not because it had failed, but because it had succeeded too well. The sophisticated psychological control systems that the fortress represented were no longer necessary because French society had been successfully pacified and controlled through other means. The middle classes that might have posed political threats had been co-opted into the administrative apparatus of royal government. The nobility had been domesticated through the court culture of Versailles. The common people remained as politically powerless as they had always been. But this apparent success masked the deeper transformations that were making institutions like the Bastille obsolete. The Enlightenment had created new ideas about individual rights and governmental legitimacy that made the arbitrary imprisonment represented by lettres de cachet increasingly difficult to justify. The financial crisis of the French state made the expense of maintaining elaborate prisons increasingly problematic. The growth of public opinion as a political force made the secrecy that had always surrounded the Bastille increasingly impossible to maintain. The 7 prisoners who remained in the Bastille in July 1789 represented different aspects of the social and political problems that the Ancien Régime had failed to solve. 4 of them were forgers, criminals whose offences reflected the increasing importance of paper money, credit, and written documentation in an economy that was becoming more complex and more dependent on trust and verification systems that the traditional authorities could not adequately police. The presence of forgers in the Bastille reveals how the prison had evolved from a facility for containing political threats to a place for dealing with new forms of criminality that challenged the foundations of economic and social order. Forgery was not just a crime against property, it was a crime against the systems of authority and authentication that made modern economic life possible. The forgers in the Bastille were not political prisoners in the traditional sense, but their crimes had political implications that made them too dangerous for ordinary criminal justice. The other 3 prisoners represented more traditional categories of social deviance that the Ancien Régime had never successfully addressed. One was confined for sexual misconduct that had scandalized his family and community. Another had been imprisoned for religious nonconformity that posed challenges to the established church. The third had been confined for mental illness that made him dangerous to himself and others, but that the existing medical and legal systems could not adequately address. These final prisoners experienced the Bastille's sophisticated system, the psychological control in its most refined form. By 1789, the procedures for managing prisoners had been perfected through centuries of experimentation and refinement. The variation in living conditions between different parts of the prison was calibrated with scientific precision. The manipulation of privileges and deprivations had been systematized to maximize psychological impact while minimizing political risk. The forgers, being common criminals rather than political prisoners, were housed in the middle floors where they experienced the comfortable dependency that the Bastille had perfected as an alternative to traditional brutality. They were provided with adequate food, comfortable furnishings, and the basic amenities that made long-term confinement bearable. But they were also subjected to the psychological pressure of uncertainty about their fate, the constant awareness that their comfortable circumstances could be withdrawn at any moment, and the gradual erosion of hope that came from indefinite confinement without clear legal proceedings. The sexual offender was held under different conditions, reflecting the social disgust that his crimes had provoked. His treatment was deliberately less comfortable, designed to reinforce his social isolation and to demonstrate the consequences of violating the moral codes that held society together. But even his harsher treatment was calculated rather than simply punitive. He was subjected to enough discomfort to satisfy social expectations while being provided enough basic necessities to prevent his death from becoming a political embarrassment. The religious nonconformist experienced perhaps the most sophisticated form of psychological pressure. His confinement was accompanied by regular visits from Orthodox clergy who attempted to convince him to recant his heretical beliefs. The prison became a site of theological debate and spiritual warfare, where the authority of the established church was brought to bear on an individual conscience through the systematic application of isolation, dependency, and intellectual pressure. The contrast between the prisoner's isolation and the revolutionary ferment that was building throughout Paris was stark and symbolic. While the inhabitants of the Bastille continued to live according to the elaborate protocols of royal imprisonment, the city around them was being transformed by new ideas about political rights, social justice, and the legitimacy of governmental authority. The financial records of the Bastille during its final months reveal the enormous cost of maintaining even this reduced population of prisoners. The elaborate system of varied accommodations, specialized diets, medical care, and security measures required a significant staff and substantial resources. State prisoners were not allowed money, but between 6 and 26 livres was allotted for board according to the rank of the prisoner. Even at the end, the prison maintained its complex hierarchy of treatment based on social status and political importance. The correspondence that the final prisoners were allowed to maintain with the outside world reveals their psychological state during these last months of the Ancien Régime. Their letters show a mixture of resignation, hope, and growing anxiety about their uncertain futures. Some had been imprisoned for so long that they had difficulty imagining life outside the fortress. Others maintained elaborate fantasies about their eventual release and return to normal society. The guards and administrators of the Bastille during this period were caught between conflicting loyalties and uncertain about their own futures. They continued to carry out their duties with professional competence, but they were also aware that the political system that employed them was under severe stress. Some began to consider how they might adapt to new political circumstances. Others remained loyal to the old system and hoped that the current crisis would pass without fundamental changes. The architectural spaces of the Bastille during these final months retained all their psychological power despite the reduced population. The empty cells seemed to echo with the memories of previous occupants. The elaborate security systems continued to function even though they were protecting fewer and fewer prisoners. The fortress remained as imposing and intimidating as ever, even as its political relevance was declining. The 7 final prisoners of the Bastille had no way of knowing that they were living through the end of an era. they continued to experience the daily rhythms of imprisonment, the careful manipulation of privileges and deprivations, the psychological pressure of dependency and uncertainty. Their personal dramas of confinement and suffering continued to unfold according to the logic of a system that had been designed to operate indefinitely. But outside the 5-foot-thick walls that had isolated so many prisoners from the changing world, revolutionary forces were building that would soon transform not just the Bastille, but the entire political and social system of France. The sophisticated psychological control mechanisms that had maintained royal authority for centuries were about to be tested by popular uprising in ways that their creators had never anticipated. The question that remained was what would happen when these carefully constructed systems of control were suddenly challenged by revolutionary violence. How would the Bastille's elaborate architecture of oppression respond to the explosive force of popular rage? And what would the revolutionaries discover when they finally broke through the barriers that had hidden the reality of royal imprisonment from public view for so long? The answers would come on July 14, 1789, when the accumulated grievances of a generation would finally explode against the stone walls that had contained so much human suffering. The storming of the Bastille would become the symbol of revolutionary liberation, but it would also reveal truths about the nature of royal power that were more disturbing than the revolutionaries had ever imagined. The morning of July 14, 1789, dawned grey and humid over Paris, with storm clouds gathering both in the sky and in the streets where angry crowds were beginning to assemble. The citizens who would storm the Bastille that day had no comprehensive understanding of what they would find within its walls. Their knowledge came from rumours, propaganda, and the selective accounts of former prisoners who had been released under various circumstances over the years. The crowd that gathered outside the Bastille was motivated primarily by the immediate need for gunpowder, which was known to be stored within the fortress in large quantities. But as the confrontation escalated throughout the morning and early afternoon, the symbolic significance of the attack began to overshadow its practical objectives. The Bastille represented everything that the revolutionaries despised about the Ancien Régime: arbitrary authority, secret imprisonment, the power of the state to make individuals disappear without trial or accountability. When the fortress finally fell in the late afternoon, after hours of siege and negotiation, the victorious crowd poured through gates that had been sealed against the outside world for centuries. What they discovered inside would both confirm their worst suspicions about royal tyranny and reveal truths about the nature of imprisonment that were more complex and disturbing than they had expected. The liberation of the 7 remaining prisoners was accomplished quickly and with great ceremony. These individuals, who had been forgotten by the outside world, suddenly found themselves transformed into symbols of revolutionary triumph. The crowd that freed them was expecting to discover victims of unspeakable torture, broken individuals who could testify to the cruelties of royal justice. What they actually found was more psychologically complex and politically ambiguous. The 4 forgers who made up the majority of the Bastille's final population were not the political martyrs that the revolutionaries had expected to find. Their crimes were common rather than noble, their sufferings ordinary rather than heroic. But their long imprisonment under the arbitrary authority of lettres de cachet made them symbols of the legal injustices that had characterized the Ancien Régime. Their release became a political statement about the rights of all citizens to fair trial and due process. The other 3 prisoners presented even more complex symbolic challenges. The sexual offender and the religious nonconformist had been imprisoned for violations of social and moral codes that many revolutionaries still supported. Their liberation raised uncomfortable questions about the relationship between individual freedom and social order that the revolution would struggle to answer throughout its course. The mentally ill prisoner posed perhaps the greatest challenge. to revolutionary ideology. His confinement in the Bastille had been as much medical as political, reflecting the inadequacy of existing institutions for dealing with mental illness rather than simple political oppression. His liberation highlighted the need for new approaches to social problems that went beyond the simple abolition of royal authority. But it was the discovery of the physical spaces within the Bastille that provided the most dramatic evidence of the systematic nature of royal oppression. As the revolutionary crowds explored the fortress, they found architectural systems that had been designed specifically for psychological torture and control. The contrast between the comfortable middle floors and the horrific cachots below revealed the sophisticated nature of the manipulation that had characterized the prison's operations. The Bastille archives tell a different story from the exaggerated accounts of torture and suffering that had shaped public opinion. The revolutionaries discovered extensive records that documented the prison's operations in bureaucratic detail. These archives revealed that the Bastille had been run according to systematic principles rather than arbitrary cruelty, but they also showed how these systematic principles had been designed to destroy human dignity and psychological independence. The discovery of the underground cachots provided the most shocking evidence of the prison's true nature. These chambers, which had been largely empty during the final years of the Bastille's operation, still contained the architectural features that had made them instruments of torture. The weeping stone walls, the inadequate drainage systems, the complete absence of light or air circulation. The crowds could see immediately how these spaces had been designed to break human spirits through environmental oppression. But perhaps more disturbing was the discovery of chambers that appeared to have been sealed for decades or centuries. Some of these spaces contained human remains that suggested prisoners who had been forgotten and left to die. The skeletal evidence provided horrifying confirmation of the rumors that had circulated about the Bastille for generations, that people had indeed been made to disappear within its walls without any record or accountability. The architectural details that the revolutionaries discovered revealed the scientific precision with which psychological torture had been applied. The various levels of the prison, each with its specific environmental characteristics, showed how prisoners had been subjected to carefully calibrated pressures designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing political embarrassment. The discovery of this systematic approach to human destruction was more shocking than simple brutality would have been. The revolutionaries also found evidence of the prison's evolution over time. Modifications to the original structure revealed how successive generations of prison administrators had refined their techniques for psychological control. New cells had been added, existing chambers had been modified, and security systems had been improved based on centuries of experience with containing unwilling occupants. The personal effects that were discovered throughout the fortress provided intimate evidence of the human cost of royal imprisonment. Clothing, books, writing materials, and personal possessions told stories of individuals who had lived and died within these walls. Some of these items showed clear signs of the environmental conditions that had characterized different parts of the prison: rot, mildew, and decay that documented the systematic neglect of human needs. The graffiti that covered many of the prison walls provided direct testimony from previous occupants about their experiences. Names, dates, prayers, and desperate messages carved into stone revealed the psychological state of prisoners who had been subjected to the Bastille's sophisticated control systems. The revolutionaries could read these inscriptions as primary source documents about the nature of royal oppression. The discovery of the prison's elaborate security systems revealed the extent of the resources that had been devoted to maintaining the institution. Multiple levels of walls, gates, and guard stations showed how much the royal government had been willing to spend to maintain its capacity for arbitrary imprisonment. The architectural evidence made clear that this had not been a casual or incidental aspect of royal authority, but a central and carefully maintained system. The food storage and preparation areas of the Bastille revealed another aspect of the sophisticated psychological control that had characterized the institution. The revolutionaries found evidence of the elaborate system for providing different levels of accommodation to different categories of prisoners. The discovery of well-equipped kitchens alongside evidence of deliberate starvation showed how food had been used as a tool of psychological manipulation. The medical facilities within the fortress provided evidence of the prison's approach to healthcare for its inmates. The revolutionaries found that medical care had been provided selectively based on the political importance of individual prisoners rather than their actual medical needs. The systematic neglect of some prisoners' health while others received elaborate care revealed another dimension of the psychological control system. The administrative offices of the Bastille contained records that documented the prison's operations in extraordinary detail. The revolutionaries discovered files that revealed the systematic nature of the surveillance and control that had been applied to prisoners. The bureaucratic precision with which human suffering had been organized and documented was perhaps more shocking than the suffering itself. The discovery of correspondence between the Bastille and other royal institutions revealed that the fortress had been part of a broader network of facilities for controlling political opposition. Letters and reports showed how prisoners had been transferred between different institutions, how information had been shared between prison administrators, and how the systematic approach to psychological control had been coordinated across multiple facilities. The financial records of the Bastille provided evidence of the enormous cost of maintaining the institution. The revolutionaries could see exactly how much money the royal government had spent on different aspects of prison operations, from guard salaries to prisoner accommodations to facility maintenance. The systematic nature of these expenditures showed that arbitrary imprisonment had been a major budget item for the royal government. The weapons and military equipment that were discovered within the fortress revealed the extent of the force that had been available to suppress any prisoner, uprising or rescue attempt. The revolutionaries found arsenals that were designed not just to defend against external attack, but to prevent any internal challenge to the prison's authority. The discovery of these weapons provided additional evidence of the systematic nature of royal oppression. As news of the Bastille's fall spread throughout Paris and beyond, the revelations about what had been discovered within its walls contributed to the revolutionary ferment that was transforming French society. The architectural evidence of systematic psychological torture provided concrete proof of the arbitrary nature of royal authority. The discovery of forgotten prisoners and hidden chambers confirmed the worst suspicions about the secret operations of the Ancien Régime. But the complex reality of what the revolutionaries had discovered also raised difficult questions about the nature of justice and social order that would continue to challenge the revolution throughout its course. The Bastille had not been simply a place of crude brutality, it had been a sophisticated institution that had used comfort as well as deprivation, hope as well as despair, as tools of control. The psychological principles that had governed its operations would not disappear simply because the institution itself had been destroyed. The demolition of the Bastille, which began immediately after its capture, became a symbolic act that was as important as the liberation itself. The systematic destruction of the architectural systems that had enabled psychological torture was intended to ensure that such institutions could never be rebuilt. But the knowledge and experience that had created those systems remained embedded in the social and political structures of French society. The stones of the Bastille were distributed throughout France as symbols of liberation, but they also carried with them the memory of what they had witnessed. The architectural fragments became relics of a system of oppression that had been more sophisticated and more psychologically devastating than simple physical cruelty could ever have been. The revolution had destroyed the institution, but it had also discovered truths about the human capacity for systematic cruelty that would continue to haunt French society for generations to come. As the immediate celebration of liberation gave way to the longer process of revolutionary transformation, the lessons learned from the Bastille would continue to influence French political development. The discovery of what systematic psychological torture could accomplish had revealed possibilities for human control that were both terrifying and, to some, tempting. The revolution had destroyed one form of architectural oppression, but it would soon create others that were informed by the same understanding of how environment could be used to control human consciousness. The final irony of the Bastille's destruction was that it eliminated the evidence of the very system it had revealed. The demolition of the fortress destroyed the architectural proof of how sophisticated psychological control could be implemented through environmental design. Future generations would have to rely on written records and witness accounts to understand what had been accomplished within those stone walls, and such evidence could always be disputed or dismissed. The liberation of the Bastille marked the end of one era of systematic imprisonment and the beginning of another. The revolution would create its own prisons, its own systems of political control, its own methods for dealing with enemies and dissidents. The architectural principles that had governed the Bastille would not disappear. They would be adapted to serve new political purposes and new ideological goals. But for one brief moment on July 14, 1789, the stone walls that had contained so much human suffering were breached, the forgotten prisoners were freed, and the carefully guarded secrets of royal oppression were exposed to public view. The discovery of what lay hidden within the Bastille provided conclusive evidence that the Ancien Régime had been more systematically cruel, more psychologically sophisticated, and more deliberately oppressive than even its harshest critics had imagined. The revolution had begun with the destruction of a fortress, but what it had really accomplished was the revelation of a truth that would continue to influence human society long after the stones had been carted away and the prisoners had returned to the world they had almost forgotten. The medieval French dungeons that had driven prisoners insane were not relics of a barbarous past. They were harbingers of a future in which the systematic control of human consciousness would become the defining challenge of political authority.